We talked a lot about whether we would require him to come forward and give us what we believe to be a complete, accurate, and truthful statement. I think all of those who were involved never truly believed that he would give us an accurate statement. What I can tell you most affirmatively today by what happened in the courtroom is the spotlight that he tried to shine on Shanann falsely, incorrectly, and frankly a flat-out lie has been corrected.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. One aspect that's been a source of confusion with the Chris Watts case is the whole premise of the plea deal. The plea deal was all about sparing Watts the death penalty, but the death penalty was never really on the cards, and in this respect there seems to be some confusion. How does Watts really win anything when he wasn't going to be burdened with that in the first place? Now one can argue that he was, but in a moment I'm going to show you that that's not the case. But at the same time it almost seems a matter of semantics, and I'll explain that as well. Meaning the official version from the district attorney was that the plea deal was about sparing Watts the death penalty, and what we're about to see is that although officially that's not true, kind of in an unofficial way, in a way that's sort of behind the scenes, that might be true after all. Before we get to that, please subscribe, like, share amongst your networks, and if you've got anything to add, please leave a comment. And let's get started. So, an interesting analogy to the Chris Watts case is the Patrick Frazee case, a case that played out literally a couple of months later. If the Chris Watts case happened in August, then it was September, October, and then on the 22nd of November, so essentially 3 months later, the Patrick Frazee case happened. Are they related? Are they related in terms of, did Frazee see, observe, learn from what happened in the Watts case? Maybe, but irrespective of that, we can still look at the intertextualities between them, and one of them is the Chris Watts case happened in Colorado and it never went to trial. Well, what does it look like when a murder happens in Colorado and it does go to trial? In a way that's quite a funny question, because so often it seems high profile cases in Colorado don't go to trial. And what happens when they do go to trial? Well, the Patrick Frazee case is a case in point. Now there are a couple of parallels with the Frazee case that are similar but not necessarily the same as Chris Watts. One example is there is a plea deal in the Patrick Frazee case, but in that case it's with the mistress. The mistress, in exchange for her testimony, may be let off the hook for serving as long as 2 to 3 years for her alleged involvement in the crime, right? So that's the plea deal she got. Her plea deal was that she gets no prison time if everything works out. In Chris Watts' case, his plea deal was to get maximum prison time, which is not much of a deal from his perspective. But it's in another area that I think there's a lot to raise eyebrows and to think about in terms of how the Chris Watts case stacks up against the Patrick Frazee case. The Denver Channel provided some coverage at the time in terms of the Frazee case, saying that prosecutors decided in July 2019 not to file a motion in pursuit of capital punishment. So bear in mind that trial, that incident happened in November, and then there were a couple of preliminary hearings and other hearings dealing with custody, and then essentially 7 to 8 months later the prosecutors eventually filed a motion, decided that they wouldn't file a motion in pursuit of capital punishment. And what that means is that Frazee won't face the death penalty in this case, even if he's found guilty. Now, we don't know the exact details of that motion. We don't know whether the motion was contingent on the plea deal. In other words, we don't know whether Kenny said, look, I really love Chris Watts. Not Chris Watts, sorry. I really love Patrick Frazee, or I care about him. I will testify against him if you agree that he won't face the death penalty. So it's possible. I'm not sure if it's particularly likely, but it's certainly possible that this was part of the deal, that she would kind of agree to condemn him in exchange for getting herself off the hook, but also potentially getting him kind of off the hook, right? That's certainly possible, but there's also the other possibility, which is that the whole death penalty thing is kind of like a lame duck. It's just not a viable line of prosecution for prosecutors in Colorado at the present time. Now, it may seem as if things like political sentiment and political the political atmosphere and the political vibe and the political I guess sentiment, the political zeitgeist essentially, the idea that may have an impact on trials may seem to the laity, it may seem to the general population like conspiracy theory, but that's one area where it's certainly not conspiracy theory. If there's one area where the law is impacted, it's at the political level. Politics and law are intertwined. Law and politics are intertwined. A lot of politicians are lawyers. A lot of lawyers become politicians. And so there's certainly not conspiracy at those very high levels. There are conspiracies in terms of how they play with the law and how politics influences the law. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that real political and legal agendas are constantly being kindled and directed and channeled. And these are very real. It's real people engaging in these real sort of machinations. And the question is, how does this impact the real people on the ground? How does this impact someone like Chris Watts? And so we get some insight into that by looking at a present case like Patrick Frazee. Now, I know some people may argue that the Frazee case is different. You could say only one person was killed, right? And that is a distasteful comment to make. Whether it's one person or, in the Watts case, 3 and an unborn fetus, it's still a diabolical crime. It's still a violent murder of a trusted person. In his case, his fiancée, the mother of his child, right? His 1-year-old child. And so, if you're going to argue that it wouldn't qualify as a death penalty case, as a capital case, just compare that case to the Jodi Arias case, I think a lot of people would agree that the Jodi Arias case absolutely qualified as a death penalty case. It's just a manipulative, murderous, someone who brutally killed her boyfriend, also someone who trusted her. A shocking, shocking case. The Patrick Frazee case is just as shocking. It's someone who trusted him, and she was beaten to death, apparently, allegedly, with a baseball bat. It was just a really bloody scene. So there's no question that it qualified as a death penalty case. The question is, why wasn't it? Why was there a decision? Even if he's found guilty, we're not even going to go that route. And we get some insight into that when we go to March 7th, 2019. So it's right in the ballpark in terms of the timeline. If we go to the center square, a bill to abolish the death penalty is making its way through the Colorado legislature. So as a prosecutor, you wouldn't want to be kind of overseeing and investing your time in and investing your efforts in a death penalty case when behind the scenes, and you're aware of it because you're the district attorney, right? You're part of that legislature. There are efforts to do away with that whole line. So can you imagine you're in the middle of a death penalty case and someone says, well, we're going to tick this box that says in future we're not going to do death penalty cases in Colorado. All those efforts are for naught. I mean, it would be pretty embarrassing and fruitless. Does that make sense? And so you can see a similar scenario playing out as well with the Chris Watts case, where very early on people asked, is this going to be a death penalty trial? And Rourke sort of answered, well, it's way too early to answer that question. I think if he'd been more transparent, he could have said, we don't really have an appetite for the death penalty in Colorado. But if he'd said that, Chris Watts' parents may have said to him, well, then take your chances. The worst that you're going to get is a life sentence, and maybe with a good defense you could do better. He may have had other reasons for not wanting to go to trial, but the other side of the story is, in a way, Chris Watts may have been spared the death penalty. And what I mean by unofficially is, if he'd been placed in the ordinary prison population, he probably would have come to harm, and maybe not murdered, but certainly injured or harmed or whatever it is. We know from his own version told to the interrogators at Dodge County on February 18th that his experience in the sort of Greeley County prison was horrible. That people were shouting at him to kill himself, and he was certainly in fear for his life. Whenever he went somewhere, he was chaperoned, right? And so his transfer to Dodge was in a way to protect him, to keep him out of the sort of ordinary prison population, and in that way he was spared the death penalty. So in that sense, I think the deal that he got was to spare him the death penalty, not through a trial, but through the certain the specific way that he would be incarcerated. In other words, that was a concession made, it appears, by the district attorney in exchange for there not being a trial and so on. Whether that's true or not, and there is some speculation obviously here, one must still sort of wonder why this couldn't be acknowledged openly and transparently. Why the cloak and dagger? Why the subterfuge? And it may be that, as in criminal trials, you sometimes want to keep your cards to your chest in order to get to the kind of verdict you want. So you sometimes got to be, I wouldn't say dishonest, but you've got to be obscure and not completely put your cards on the table if you want a particular outcome. And when we go to that article from the Center Square, it refers to several of Colorado's district attorneys ripping the bill during the hearing, which lasted over 5 hours. The bill, to disband the death penalty. And Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke is specifically referenced here. He's also specifically referenced as the lead prosecutor in the Watts case, and he testified that the death penalty was an incentive for a guilty plea. In fact, Michael Rourke's exact words when his testimony was, without the death penalty on the books in the state of Colorado, he would not have pleaded guilty. And that's really interesting. So you certainly have that fielded in that scenario, that the death penalty looks like something that Rourke wants, right? And based on the merits of what he's arguing there, he certainly seems to be arguing that the death penalty was in play, and that one could have shaken sort of a stick at Watts and said, if you don't play ball, you're going to get the death penalty. But the Patrick Frazee case shows a different scenario. It shows how a death penalty qualifying case is simply not even fielded in that way. And it makes one wonder, would they have pursued it if it had gone to trial? Would they have pursued it? Now, bear in mind, this whole thing is going through the legislature, so and the Chris Watts case happened, as we say, 2 to 3 months before Frazee. So had Watts taken his chances, one wonders whether the death penalty would have been sought, and even if it had been sought, whether it would have been possible. It's just an interesting legal argument. What do you guys think about it?
Significantly, when his co-workers arrived at the tank battery later that morning, to a person, they all described him as acting completely normally. It was a normal workday, even while his daughter sank in the oil and water not far away from him. And then his efforts at deception truly began. We've all seen the emotionless interviews that the defendant gives to the local media, asking for help in locating his family. We watched as he claimed that the house was empty without them, and that he hoped that they were somewhere safe, and that he just wanted them to come home. He told investigators that they were at home sleeping when he left for work that morning, and that Shanann had told him that she was taking the girls to a friend's house for the day. What is striking about this case, Your Honor, beyond the horrors that I've already described to you, is the number of collateral victims that he created by his actions. While he stood in front of TV cameras asking for the safe return of his family, scores of law enforcement officers, neighbors, friends, and family scoured the area, fretted for their safe return. They texted him begging for any information and sending him their best wishes, all the while he hid what he had done.